Good afternoon from Federal Hill, Baltimore. Talking today about events in 1861, April and May of 1861, right at the beginning of the American Civil War here in Baltimore. Specifically, the title of this little tour today is Under the Guns. We're talking about Benjamin Butler and Baltimore under martial law. And when we talk about being under the guns, as you can see from this Parrott rifle behind me, which is a commemorative now, Baltimore, that's the downtown of the Inner Harbor district there. If you command Federal Hill with a battery of artillery, you control the city of Baltimore. So if you bring artillery up here, Baltimore literally is under the guns. Now what you're looking at today is a 1960s, 1970s, 1980s waterfront. In 1861, what's now the Inner Harbor, a tourist area, was very much the center of the working port. Now the port has moved further out into the city. So if we look further down the Patapsco, you'll see the Domino's warehouse and the fuel terminals at Cape Canton and beyond that. But this was the original Inner Harbor. Here was the original location of the port. It was a working port, so there were piers running out here. The piers are now inhabited by things like the National Aquarium there, and Pier 6 down there, which is a concert venue. But this was a working port. Ships came up here into the Inner Harbor. They unloaded at the docks at the Inner Harbor. There were warehouses here. State Tobacco Warehouse, very important for Maryland, was down there on Light Street. So this was the center, the city center of Baltimore and the center of Baltimore's commerce in 1861 at the outbreak of the Civil War. So now, why was Baltimore important at the outbreak of the Civil War? We need to look back a little bit at the location of Baltimore. It sits in Maryland, obviously, and now Maryland is a border state. It lays just below the Mason-Dixon line. In the 1860 election, it voted constitutional unionist. It did not vote for Lincoln. There were 4 candidates in that election, but it did not vote for a candidate that wished to secede. It voted to remain in the Union. So very interesting for a border state. There were divided loyalties, obviously. There was pro-Confederate sympathy in some places, particularly in Baltimore City. The mayor of Baltimore and the police chief of Baltimore were known to be Confederate sympathizers. But in that rush of states that in January of 1861 that joined South Carolina in seceding from the Union, Maryland was not one of them. It remained within the Union. In a strange sort of situation, because Maryland was a border state and a slave state, so it was a slave state but within the Union, so with some divided loyalties. So that puts Baltimore and Maryland into a political predicament in 1861, the beginning of 1861, but it's also a physical predicament. If you look at the eastern seaboard and you see where Washington DC lays, right on the border of Virginia, and above Washington DC is Maryland, and smack on the coast there is Baltimore. The rail lines down the east coast to Washington DC, coming from Philadelphia in the north, pass through Baltimore. You cannot get to Washington DC from Philadelphia and New York without passing through Baltimore. So Baltimore is a strategic location during the war. It will be behind the lines, but it is a strategic location. You need to control Baltimore because you need to be able to move troops down to Washington DC in the theater of war in Virginia, and you also need to be able to move your logistical supplies from those factories up in the north, those factories in Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania. You need to be able to move those supplies down to the theater of war, also by rail. So Baltimore is very important. When the Civil War broke out with the attack on Fort Sumter, and President Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers. So he called upon the states to supply militia to make up that 75,000 volunteers, and those state militias would be temporarily brought into federal service for 3 months. Lincoln believed that the war could be over in 3 months. He was to be proved wrong on that count. So the states in the north began mobilizing their militia. One of those states was Massachusetts. Massachusetts immediately mobilized 4 of its regiments of militia. And one of those regiments that came down was the lead regiment that was coming down from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C., was the 6th Massachusetts Infantry, raised in the vicinity of Lowell, Massachusetts. Those clothing factories and cotton mills in Lowell. So it's the 6th Massachusetts. They're on their way through Baltimore. At the time in Baltimore, if you're coming through by train, you arrive kind of down here at the President Street Railroad Station, which is now the Civil War Museum. You disembarked that train, made your way through the inner harbour, boarded a new train on the Baltimore and Ohio at Camden Station, which is right now by Camden Yards, the Orioles baseball park, and then you continued on your way to Washington, D.C. So as the 6th Massachusetts approached Baltimore, a mob formed. This was April the 19th, 1861. A pro-secessionist mob, a mob of apprentices that joined on for fun and games, local rowdies that joined on for fun and games, bars emptied, taverns emptied, and a mob grew. This mob wished to prevent the 6th Massachusetts from passing through Baltimore. They did not want those troops to go south to Washington, D.C. They wished to turn them back. And so here, along Pratt Street, the street that fronts the inner harbour, as the 6th Massachusetts were making their way along Pratt Street, it's about a mile between the 2 railway stations, they came under attack from the mob. First it was bricks, horse excrement, bottles, that sort of thing were being thrown. Members of the mob tried to get in amongst the column, grab away rifles, but soon shots were being exchanged. Baltimore had a reputation of being a violent city, particularly during elections. There was often street fighting during elections. Shots were exchanged during elections. I believe in the election of 1858, up in the 2nd Ward, somebody even used a cannon. So Baltimore had a reputation as Mobtown. So this was not to be unexpected that a mob would try and attack troops. But fighting broke out, shooting broke out on both sides. 4 soldiers were killed, 12 Baltimoreans were killed, and a substantial number wounded as well. So the 6th Massachusetts, bloodied through Baltimore streets, made its way to Washington, D.C. and became the 1st militia regiment to arrive in Washington, D.C. They were then billeted in the as yet uncompleted US Capitol building. Now additional regiments were on their way south, regiments of militia from Massachusetts and also New York. The next ones in line were the 8th Massachusetts and the 7th New York, coming close behind. But the mayor of Baltimore and the chief of police in Baltimore decided that they did not want a repetition of this riot. They decided they would close Baltimore to Union troops. Easier said than done, you might think. A few policemen armed with pistols and billy clubs are not really going to be able to turn back a regiment of 1,000 infantrymen armed with muskets and bayonets. So what the mayor of Baltimore said to his chief of police was, hop on a train, go north up to Gunpowder River and burn the railroad bridges. Burn the railroad bridges between the Gunpowder and Baltimore. And so off Marshal Kane went, chief of police from Baltimore, up into Harford County and started burning railway bridges in Harford County and Baltimore County back towards Baltimore. Thus, effectively destroyed the railroad line into Baltimore and preventing troops from moving south. So, at the town of Perryville on the Susquehanna River, it's in Cecil County, so if you're coming down Interstate 95 and you're coming through Delaware and you cross into Maryland, that first county that you cross into on Interstate 95 is Cecil County. and you keep heading south, and eventually you're going to come to a very large river and go over that on a very tall interstate bridge. The Tidings Bridge is going to take you over the Susquehanna River, and that river, there was no railroad bridge across the river at the time. So if you were coming from Philadelphia to point south, you'd arrive at Perryville. There was a rail yard at Perryville. They would shunt the rail carriages onto railroad ferries, ferry them across the river to Havre de Grace, reassemble the train, and then continue on its way south. So the 8th Massachusetts and the 7th New York arrive at Perryville, and they hear news that ahead of them the railroad bridges have been destroyed. Now, there's no point in them crossing the river, they think, because we can cross the river, but all we're going to do is end up in Havre de Grace. There's no way south from Havre de Grace because the railroad bridges have been destroyed. So what are we going to do? What they need is they need some leadership. And the leadership they got came from a man called Benjamin Butler. Now, Ben Butler is an interesting man in the Civil War. He crops up in several places, in several predicaments, some of which are fortuitous for the Union, some of which are calamitous, all down to Butler himself. And so who was Benjamin Butler? Well, he was a flabby, bald-headed, walrus-moustached Massachusetts attorney from Lowell, Massachusetts. He was a Democrat, but a Unionist, so he wanted to remain in the Union. And he was a colonel in the Massachusetts Militia. He was a colonel without a regiment in the Massachusetts Militia. He was one of several supernumerary colonels that the governor of Massachusetts had appointed to the militia, and these are mostly attorneys, lawyers, Massachusetts lawyers. Ben Butler had one thing going for him, though. He represented a lot of business interests in Lowell, Massachusetts, a big industrial town, and one of the interests that he represented was banks. And when the governor of Massachusetts was calling out the militia, before they'd been brought into federal service, they had to be equipped and paid by the state of by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the governor of Massachusetts needed money. The only place he was going to get that from was not from state coffers, because those are pretty bare. He was going to have to take out bonds and loans from banks. Butler was able to secure loans from bankers that he knew for the governor to help him with mobilization of the militia. So a grateful governor, though Butler lacked seniority, Butler was appointed Major General of the Massachusetts Militia and put in command of the Massachusetts Militia. So as a Major General of Volunteers, Butler arrives at Perryville, Maryland. He hears what's happened to the 6th Massachusetts, one of his hometown regiments, being bloodied as it moves through Baltimore. That makes him angry. He hears that the mayor of Baltimore has had the railroad bridges burned between Havre de Grace and Baltimore to prevent troops coming, and that makes him angry. Now, Butler is a shrewd man, a canny man, you might even say a devious man, so he tries to think of a way around this. Gets out a railroad map, tries to figure out if there's any other way around Baltimore by railroad. Not directly, but he looks down the coast, he looks down the Chesapeake Bay and sees Annapolis, the state capital, the site of the Naval Academy. There's a branch line from Annapolis that runs into a place called Annapolis Junction, which connects below Baltimore with the main Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and can get down. So if he can get troops to Annapolis and onto that branch line by getting them down the Chesapeake Bay, but how is he going to get them down the Chesapeake Bay? And he strikes upon an idea. What he's going to do is he's going to commandeer those railroad ferries, the railroad ferries that normally just go across the Susquehanna River carrying railroad carriages. He's going to commandeer the largest of those. It's called the Maryland. He's going to cram the entire 8th Massachusetts onto that, and he's going to sail down the Chesapeake, followed eventually by the 7th New York, down the Chesapeake and land at Annapolis. He lands at Annapolis. He takes command of the Naval Academy. He takes command of Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, which is moored there as a training ship. Takes command of the State House, the state legislature. Establishes military control over Annapolis. The branch line has had some damage done to it by Confederate sympathizers, by secessionist sympathizers. Tracks have been pulled up. Butler sends men to work repairing those tracks. They managed to locate a steam locomotive. The steam locomotive has been disabled. But luckily for Butler, this steam locomotive was one of many that had been built in Massachusetts. And there were men in the 8th Massachusetts who were railwaymen who knew how to repair the railway locomotive. So they got the railway locomotive fixed, they hitched up a train, they got the track fixed, and they were able to move onwards to Annapolis Junction and then onto the branch line and then connect to the Baltimore, Ohio, and get the 8th Massachusetts and the 7th New York down to Washington, D.C. And by this circuitous route around Baltimore, by this end run down the Chesapeake Bay into Annapolis, Butler had figured out a way to get Union reinforcements from the north down to Washington, D.C. Thus, really saving Washington, D.C. Which brings us back to Baltimore. So this has all happened at the beginning, well, the middle of April of 1861. The riot took place in April 19th, 1861. This action with Butler bringing the steamer down from Perryville, the 22nd and 23rd of April, so a very concentrated period of time. Now Butler, in command now of 2 regiments of Massachusetts Militia, the 6th and the 8th, that are in Washington, D.C. 2 additional regiments have been sent down the coast to Fortress Monroe in Virginia. But Butler now still a little bit angry about what occurred in Baltimore. Baltimore to him is a nest of vipers. Baltimore needs to be dealt with. So of his own accord, the commanding general at the time, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, old Fuss and Feathers, was formulating a plan to restore order in Baltimore. He thought that he would need 10,000 troops. He thought that he would need 3 months to enforce martial law and repair the railroads through Baltimore and make that secure. 10,000 men in 3 months. Well, Benjamin Butler wasn't having any of that. He was angry, and his Massachusetts boys from the 6th Massachusetts, who'd been bloodied on their march through, wanted a little revenge as well. So on the 12th of May, less than a month after the riot, on the night of the 12th of May, in a rainstorm, Butler and the 6th Massachusetts arrived by train in Baltimore and came up onto this promontory here overlooking the harbour, Federal Hill. It's named Federal Hill after the establishment of the federal government and the Constitution. Goes back that far. So the 6th Massachusetts entrench themselves, and they bring up an artillery battery up here onto Federal Hill overlooking the city. So when the city awakens the next morning, there's 1,000 Union soldiers up here on Federal Hill with the city under its guns. That also then gives Butler the opportunity to arrest the mayor and arrest the chief of police. They certainly had that coming, what with their tolerance of the riot and also then their subsequent burning of the railway bridges to prevent Union troops from moving through the city. So he places them under arrest, places the city effectively under martial law to establish control of Baltimore. He sends men north to start repairing those railroad bridges, those railroad trestles, and once during May of 1861 those railroad bridges to the north of the city are restored, normal railroad traffic can continue, and now the passage of troops and the passage of supplies can come down unabated. So again, if Butler had waited for Winfield Scott's 3-month, 10,000-man plan, this would not have happened in May. It would have probably happened perhaps in July, just as the enlistments of the 3-month volunteers were running out. The entire basis of the Civil War would have been trying to repair some railroad bridges north of Baltimore. But Butler would not wait for orders. An arrogant man, so acted on his own initiative. He thought he knew what was right, and so he would do what he thought was right. He was a Major General of Massachusetts Volunteers. He would take his Massachusetts Volunteers into Baltimore. He'd put these bloody Marylanders under his guns, and he'd make them do what he wanted them to do. So there we go again. Butler, first of all, with his circumvention of the block railroads by making that end run down the Chesapeake Bay and opening a seaward route to Washington, D.C., and then eventually coming in and placing Baltimore under effective martial law and re-establishing the physical railroad connection. So that made Butler a very famous man. That put his name in the newspapers. Both of those events put Butler's name in the newspapers. Also made him a very unpopular man. He was acting without orders. He annoyed Winfield Scott. He rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And they decided, well, what are we going to do with Benjamin Butler? They decided they would send Benjamin Butler as a Major General of Massachusetts Volunteers. There's 2 Massachusetts regiments down at Fort Monroe in Virginia, so that's at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac, so down where Norfolk Naval Yard, Hampton Roads, Newport News shipyards is, all down there. At Hampton, there is Fort Monroe, a big coastal fortress, which was still held by the Union, even though it's on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. And there were 2 Massachusetts regiments down there. Off you go then, down to Fort Monroe, and you'll command these regiments down there. They thought he was out of the way and got rid of. Did Abraham Lincoln rescind any of the actions that had been taken in Baltimore? No. Federal Hill became a garrison throughout the war. So right now it's a children's play park and a dog park and an open area where people can come and relax, eat sandwiches, hang out with their families. Great views over the city. But throughout the Civil War, fortifications were built here, earthworks were built here, additional artillery was placed here, wooden barracks were built here, sufficient for at least a regiment. So throughout the Civil War, 10 regiments in total served as the garrison here in rotation. So men from all different states served here, garrisoning Baltimore as part of 8th Corps or the Middle Department, securing those railroad lines essentially from Philadelphia all the way down to Washington, D.C. There were Union forces that spent the entire Civil War protecting this vitally strategic logistical chain of railroads. So did Lincoln rescind any of that? No. He approved of the suspension of civil rights as martial law, which will, of course, if anybody's a legal scholar and they've heard of ex parte Merryman, that'll take place here in Baltimore as well, where Merryman is arrested, held without trial. Justice Roger Taney issues a writ of habeas corpus. Merryman is being held at Fort McHenry down there on the Patapsco River. Fort McHenry, famous from the War of 1812, and this monument behind me is to Major Armistead, who commanded Fort McHenry during the War of 1812 and the British assault on that's famous from the Star-Spangled Banner. So the fortress is being used as a prison temporarily by the Union forces. This unfortunate chap Merryman's being held there without trial. Justice Taney, a secessionist sympathizer, quite an awful man. He handed down the Dred Scott decision, issues the writ of habeas corpus and tries to have him freed. But you try marching up as a federal marshal to a fort bristling with cannon and troops with muskets, and you say, well, I have a warrant to release Mr. Merryman. And they're like, you're not getting past us. So the martial law, essentially, of Baltimore and military governance of Baltimore continued throughout the war, and Baltimore was kept on a tight leash and kept acquiescent to the Union cause during the Civil War. Now, don't get me wrong about Maryland in total. Maryland was a border state with split loyalties, but the majority, by a factor of 9-1, if we look at all the Marylanders who participated in the Civil War, there are effectively 2 Maryland battalions of Confederate infantry, a couple of batteries of artillery, and a regiment of cavalry. But with regard to the Union side, we're looking at 11 regiments of infantry and multiple regiments of, multiple batteries of artillery, and when you conclude when you add in the Home Guard and Patapsco Home Guard, the Purnell Legion, as well as the regular cavalry units from Maryland, the Union volunteers outnumbered the Confederate volunteers in Maryland 9-1. So Maryland was a predominantly Union state, but it did have a number of Confederate secessionist sympathizers, and so that's why it was necessary to maintain a guard on the railroads and maintain a guard on the city of Baltimore. 1864, several years into the Civil War, so 3 years into the Civil War, 1864, there's actually a cavalry raid by a man called Harry Gilmore, a Maryland native, born outside of the city of Baltimore, lived north of Baltimore, a Confederate cavalry officer during the war. He led a raid of a couple of hundred Confederate cavalrymen in a ride around Baltimore, spooked everybody, burned some railroad bridges, and then made off quietly during the night. So even though Baltimore was pretty far north, the Confederate cavalry raiders could, if they so wished, sneak small bodies through and cause some mayhem. So therefore it was important to keep Baltimore under these guns. So what happened to old Ben Butler? Well, last we heard of Benjamin Butler, he'd been sent in almost disgrace down to a garrison post commanding a coastal fort on the tip of the peninsula down in, I guess James County? Down that way? South of Williamsburg, so maybe. Anyway, so down Hampton Roads. Out of the way, in command of a couple of Maryland regiments. Massachusetts regiments of militia that have now been brought into Union service. And if nothing had happened, he'd have quite happily, I guess, spent the rest of the war down there in an administrative position, commanding that little department. But then something else happens. Another piece of history occurs in which Benjamin Butler plays an important role. So Benjamin Butler is down there in Virginia, and across on Virginia soil itself, away from the fort, Confederate militia dig earthworks and trenches and emplace cannons to prevent Union troops from coming out of Fort Monroe and raiding into Virginia. And also, if they wanted to attack Fort Monroe, these would be good earthworks for them to emplace siege cannon in, heavy cannon, and bombard the fort. So Virginia is a slave state. If you want work done in a slave state, if you want ditches and trenches dug, you typically rely on slaves, enslaved people, to do that for you. So one night at Fort Monroe, the sentries report movement, and 3 enslaved African Americans come into the fort. They've escaped from the Confederate lines where they'd been forced to dig trenches. They were digging trenches for the Confederate troops, and they've escaped and managed to reach Fort Monroe. Now at this time there's no Emancipation Proclamation, there's no move within the Union to free the slaves whatsoever. Maryland was still a slave state, Delaware was a slave state, Kentucky was a slave state, Missouri was a slave state, Tennessee was a slave state. So states that were technically still within the Union still maintained slavery. Slaves were property. There was a Fugitive Slave Act. If a slave ran away, they had to be returned to their master. And in accordance with the Fugitive Slave Act, the titular owner of these 3 enslaved men, colonel in the Confederate militia, arrived at Fort Monroe under a flag of truce and demanded that Benjamin Butler, that under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, he return these 3 men. Now Butler, as I said, was an attorney and a shrewd man and a canny man and a devious man, and he didn't really want to return these 3 people. So he came up with a lawyer's decision. He decided on the spot that if Virginia had seceded from the Union and was in rebellion, then they had no right to appeal to the Fugitive Slave Act. And that if they were in rebellion, then their property could be confiscated. And normally people would think of that as, well, we're going to sequester, we're going to take away your horse because we need your horse for the cavalry, and we're going to take this field of grain because we need it for forage. That's what they thought about confiscation of property. Or they may commandeer your house to use as a hospital or as a headquarters building. That's what people thought in war would be taking people's property. But Butler extended that to these 3 enslaved men. He declared these 3 men to be contraband of war, which is where in the early Civil War we get the term contraband from. So contraband of war, and as they were contraband of war, they were now the property of the United States Army. And as they were now the property of the United States Army, this Confederate colonel could, go pound sand. So Butler decided that these 3 men were now contraband of war, and that he would use them himself as, help around the fort, and this then would, of course, then lead more enslaved people to escape and come into Butler's lines and be declared contraband of war. Puts them in an interesting legal position. Could the US Army legally own slaves? The answer to that is no, the US Army could not legally own a slave. So these men now existed in a sort of legal no man's land, really, sort of like a legal grey area. They were no longer owned by their titular masters, so they were no longer owned by their titular masters, but they could not be freed because no law had been passed to free slaves, yet they were in the employ of the Union Army, who could not really employ them as slaves, but could only employ them under this sort of guise of contraband of war. So that's where we get the term contraband from. It crops up a lot when we're referring to runaway enslaved peoples that join onto Union armies, particularly during campaigns in Virginia, and then later with Sherman coming through Georgia and the Carolinas. They talk about the numbers of contrabands that attach themselves to the Union Army. So that's where that phrase comes from, invented by Benjamin Butler. 3rd time around, Benjamin Butler. So that's a 3rd Butler contribution to early Civil War history. Now, really, Abraham Lincoln is the commander-in-chief, and he's the one that has to decide again whether Butler's actions stand or do not stand. Butler's made this decision. There have been other decisions made. For example, Major General John C. Fremont had declared that all slaves in his department were free, and Lincoln had to send a memo to him saying, sorry, John, you don't have the right to free slaves. So Lincoln had respected property and respected the rights of those owners in that sense. But what Butler had done, Lincoln was also a lawyer and a canny man and a shrewd man, and you may argue a devious man, and he really appreciated what Ben Butler had done with this creation of this category of contraband of war. So he endorsed that, and that became then the official policy of the Union Army, that escaped enslaved people could be taken under Union protection as contraband of war. So that's 3 legacies of Ben Butler. That end run with the steamer down the Chesapeake Bay, bypassing Baltimore, getting troops into Washington, D.C., saving the Union, saving the capital, him returning later to Baltimore, and putting a garrison here on Federal Hill, and putting Baltimore under effective martial law from May of 1861 onwards. So that's again him. Down at Fortress Monroe, establishing the principle of contraband of war. It's again Benjamin Butler. So he is in that early period a very interesting man. He goes on to have a career throughout the war, maybe not as distinguished. He will later be the military commander in New Orleans. He will later be brought back up to Virginia and in the Bermuda 100 in the campaigns of 64 and 65. Lead forces there, not particularly well, but he's a good political general. After the war, he'll become governor of Massachusetts, and more of a radical, liberating Republican in the style of Lincoln, and as a supporter of General Grant than would otherwise be considered. So Benjamin Butler, to hear people talk about his time in Louisiana and in New Orleans, you'd think the man was a monster. And perhaps he was brash and arrogant and upset a lot of people with some of his language down there and some of his actions. But when you look at what Butler did here in April and May of 1861, I would argue that in getting those two regiments, the 8th Massachusetts and the 7th New York, into Washington, D.C., at a time in which the capital was really reliant on handfuls of militia to defend the capital against militia gathering in Virginia just across the Potomac. Washington could have been captured early in the war by the Confederacy, and by the grace of God and by the grace of Benjamin Butler, it was not. So I would argue that in April of 1861, Butler's action saved Washington, D.C. from capture. I do believe that. Second, in placing Baltimore under martial law on his own initiative, he had no time to wait. We talk about the slowness of Winfield Scott as commanding general, his nickname Fuss and Feathers, rightly given to him, I think, at this point. He'd been in command for a long time. He was an old man. He had gout. He could not ride a horse. He had to be taken around in a carriage. It would not be long before he would be replaced as Commander-in-Chief of the armies by George McClellan. And so waiting for Winfield Scott to come up with a war-winning plan, certainly even just a plan to restore control, restore law and order in Baltimore, and hear the sirens, because welcome to Baltimore, to restore law and order in Baltimore, waiting for Winfield Scott to do that would have taken forever. So Ben Butler taking the initiative to bring the 6th Massachusetts back here to Baltimore and take up position here on Federal Hill, again, I believe, was a major contribution to solidifying the Union position at the beginning of the war in May of 1861. And then with the contraband of war, I just think that that's a fabulous lawyer's trick, almost a fantastic legal way out of dealing with the institution of slavery. It was the first step along the way to the Emancipation Proclamation, which would come in 1862. But it was the first initial step, I believe. So Ben Butler, early in the war, we might talk about him later in the war another day. We might go down to the Bermuda 100 and talk about whether he was an effective field commander. He was not. Spoiler. We could do that another day on a different tour. But today, really all I wanted to concentrate was on Ben Butler in April and May of 1861. And I think he did a darn good job and deserves perhaps a lot more credit than he gets. He's often dismissed as a strange-looking man, the body and the face of a walrus, maybe. He was cross-eyed, he had a droopy moustache, a bald head, what we would today call a flowing mullet at the back of his bald head. Whenever you see him in a photograph in a dress uniform, he looks like he's wearing a sack of potatoes. So I feel your pain, Ben Butler, as somebody who could wear an Armani suit and it looked like a sack of potatoes. I do feel your pain. So he's often a figure of caricature and a figure of mockery. And he's derided in the South as being the monster of New Orleans. And that's generally the reputation that Butler has. He's often dismissed as a political general, as a Massachusetts lawyer, These are all words that we don't really like. Political general, Massachusetts lawyer. I mean, who likes a Massachusetts lawyer? Nobody. Not even Massachusetts lawyers like Massachusetts lawyers, to be honest. So he's often dismissed, and I think that's unfair. We need to look at what he did in those first 2 months of the war in 1861. So that pretty much wraps us up today. So if you're actually in Baltimore, Federal Hill, as you can see from the beginning, just across the other side of the Inner Harbour, so it's easily within walking distance. You walk around the Inner Harbour and up onto Federal Hill. You get some great vistas for taking photographs of the city. It's a nice neighbourhood up here. It's quite a quiet neighbourhood by Baltimore standards. If you walk down the hill to the west, down towards Light Street, there's some restaurants and shops on Light Street, and you walk down to what was the old Cross Street Market, one of the old Baltimore indoor markets, which is now all little Gucci coffee shops and restaurants and so forth. So it's quite a nice neighbourhood. Free 2-hour parking up here. It's usually quite quiet. It's a weekday. Plenty of parking up here. As you can see, kids playing behind us, people walking their kids, walking their dogs. Great views of the city. Great place to come and hang out. So if you're visiting Baltimore, do come and check it out. Thanks for joining me today. I've got more tours coming up. You'll see all those listed as events on the Facebook page, facebook.com/walkingtheground, which is probably where you're seeing this. I will download this video as well and then post it to YouTube just as a backup, so that if anything happens on Facebook, we've got a YouTube backup for it. So there's a channel over at YouTube, and I'll post that link as well. You can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com, and we're Walking Ground there, because we couldn't get Walking the Ground because it's just one character too many. So thanks Twitter for that. So Walking Ground on Twitter. And we're also on Ko-fi.com if you want to support the content that we provide. We do these live streams for free, but if you would like to support us, just buy us a $3 coffee as a way of saying thank you, and we'd greatly appreciate a coffee, and literally do spend that $3 at Dunkin' buying a coffee. So that's one way to support us. Another way to support us, of course, is to, if you like what we're doing, click the like button, click the share button, share it with your friends. So if you've got a friend that's interested in military history, history in general, battlefield tours, military content, etc., and you think they'd be interested in it, share it with your friends, spread the love, and thank you for joining me today. It was good to see you all. Anybody that's to put a comment on here, I can't really see them because of the glare from the sun. So as soon as I've finished, I'm going to go back through the comments and answer any questions that you folks had for me. So thanks for joining me today. It's good to see you all.